Hello, you beautiful people. Today we are back for another waiver wire must roster. This time it's week 6 edition. Apologies for not posting that much this week. I had this essay that I was working on. I just kind of got distracted and didn't have enough time, but excuses aside, I'll have 4 videos coming out this week, including this one. If you're new around here, if you don't know how this works, we go through some guys that are must roster for shallow leagues, which are like, 10 to 12 teams and below, and then we go to some waiver wire must rosters for some deeper leagues, which will be like your 14 team and above. So we'll go ahead and get started with the shallow leagues, but before I do that, actually, I should mention there is a lot of game weeks. Well, not a lot. There's 3 teams that have 2 games this week, so that's going to be Charlotte, the Rockets, and the Raptors. And obviously there's a lot of great waiver wire pickups on those teams, but there's lots of, just because there's lots of injuries to the teams right now. So if you want, like on the days that those teams have games, if you want to know who I think's a waiver wire pickup, I would join the Discord through the link in the description, and I'll say who I think are some good streamers on the day of their games. But anyways, moving on, the first player on my list for the shallow league must roster is DeAnthony Melton, and I think it's pretty evident as to why. Maxey and Harden both out for an extended period of time. If you're looking at the Philadelphia backcourt, I mean, the one you're expecting to pick up the most production is going to be Melton, and as we saw last game against Minnesota, he ended up with 55 fantasy points. Now, obviously, I don't think he's going to average anything close to 55 fantasy points, but I am expecting him to be in the high 30s, and given that he's only rostered in about 16% of leagues right now, that is way too low for a guy that's probably going to be like in the upper 30s, best case for fantasy average for these next, 4 weeks. Maybe high 30s, like for a sustained period of time, is a bit optimistic, but I am pretty high on Melton. He contributes a lot in the stocks categories, and over his last 7 days, I mean, he's pretty much around there. So definitely consider picking him up if he's on your waiver wire. Anyways, moving on. Next up on my list is going to be Tyus Jones. This is another one. Again, a lot of these guys that I'm going to talk about today very contingent on injuries to like key players on the teams, on their respective teams. Tyus Jones is only rostered in about 10% of leagues right now, but whenever Ja Morant goes down, he is just such a solid, consistent performer. You're definitely going to get within the 30s per average per game, and just getting that off the waiver wire is just a great add, especially for this week. Ja Morant is listed as week to week right now, and we don't know when he's going to be returning, but for the foreseeable future, I definitely think Tyus Jones is going to have some boosted fantasy value. This is actually the reason I drafted him in a 20 team, was just for situations like this when Ja Morant goes down, because Tyus Jones is one of the best backup point guards in the league. I talked about this in a recent waiver wire video when Ja Morant was also going to miss a game, and he ended up having 35 fantasy points that game. If you look at his last 2, he had 29 fantasy points against OKC, 26 against Brooklyn. I would expect low 30s consistently, while Ja Morant is going to miss time, like I mentioned. So that's going to do it for him. Moving on, I mean, this person would be higher on my list, but we just don't know as much about when, Chris Paul is going to be returning into the lineup as we do with the other players. So, of course, Melton's going to start us off. Then we have Tyus Jones. If I haven't mentioned this already, I do kind of list them in order of who I would pick up first. But yeah, it's Cameron Payne, third on my list. He's just been an absolute monster with Chris Paul missing time. 2 52 fantasy point games. He had a 32 fantasy point game in there. I did not know he was this good. I'm going to be honest. I mean, 21, 7, and 9 against New York. Very solid efficiency as well. If he's going to continue running like this, I mean, absolutely must rosters. Completely a no-brainer. The only thing that's contingent on is whether Chris Paul is going to be returning to the lineup at any time soon or not. And that's kind of a mystery. I mean, initially they said the injury was nothing serious, and now he's been missing for like the past 5 games or something. The most recent report on him is just that he won't play Sunday and will be reevaluated later next week. So he's definitely, not definitely, but he's probably going to be out this week as well. So definitely pick up Cam Payne if he's for some reason still on your waiver wire. Kind of just assumed he would be rostered in all competitive leagues though. But yeah, maybe I'll restructure this. I would probably pick up Payne first and foremost above Melton and Tyus Jones. But anyways, moving on, we got Bones Highland. He's another guy that, again, just with Jamal Murray and Nikola Jokic being out, we don't know when they're necessarily going to be returning. But the Nuggets do have a back-to-back on Tuesday and Wednesday, so if you monitor the statuses and it looks like Murray and Jokic are trending towards not playing in those games, I think Bones Highland becomes an absolute must roster. He just had 29 and 6 against Dallas tonight, putting up 52 fantasy points, and he's getting around, high 20s to low 30s minutes per game. Definitely want to take advantage of that kind of usage rate that he's getting as well when Murray's out and Jokic is out. And then in a similar vein, we have Bruce Brown, and again, he's a guy that he's rostered in about 11% of leagues, which to me is surprisingly low, but he's been consistently solid over the past 5 games ever since the Nuggets started dealing with all these illnesses and Rona issues. But I mean, looking at his fantasy points, 33 tonight against Dallas, 42 last night against Dallas, 2 days ago against Dallas. Overall, he'll probably end up averaging around low 30s, so just kind of a do-it-all player. He doesn't contribute, too heavily in any particular category, but he contributes across the board pretty solidly, so you're always going to get some kind of production out of him. So I definitely think he is a must roster for this week, especially given their back-to-back on Tuesday, Wednesday. I would absolutely take advantage and pick up a nugget, either Bones Highland or Bruce Brown on Tuesday. Of course, contingent on the injury news, as I mentioned. And then lastly, this is a player that I talked about last week, so I just didn't want to put him at the top of the video, at the top of the list again, because that'd be pretty boring. But Killian Hayes, I still think remains a must roster. He has had a few down games from what was expected given the Cade Cunningham injury news. But I mean, last 7 days he's averaging 33 fantasy points. He had that 50 fantasy point game against the LA Lakers, which is boosting it. But still, he is capable of having nights like that. I don't think he's that good of a player, but if you're going to put the ball in his hands on a bad team and let him, work through it. He ended up having 18 and 9 against the Lakers. He's had a few high assist games, and if he can have the odd good scoring night here and there, he's definitely going to be giving you some fantasy value, and I definitely think that makes him a must roster for this week. So now we'll go ahead and get into my must rosters for the deeper leagues. These are guys that aren't rostered in as high a percentage of leagues as these other guys, so anyways, we'll just go ahead and get right into that. Alright, so first up is Shake Milton, and the reasoning is pretty much exactly the same as I used with DeAnthony Melton. I mean, we already know Sixers backcourt, they're hurt. Who's going to step up? It's probably going to be DeAnthony Melton and Shake Milton, that'll get the majority of the minutes. Last 7 days, he's only averaging around 24 fantasy points per game, but I mean, he had a solid game against the Timberwolves, put up 27 points, had 15 against Milwaukee, and I would expect him, to get in the low 30s for averaging, at least for the next week or so. It's just kind of playing beside Embiid. He's getting a lot of open looks. He's getting asked to create a lot more with these two players out. I don't want to sound like a broken record as I was with DeAnthony Melton, so I'll just say that I do consider him a must roster for this week, especially for the deeper leagues. He's only rostered in about 2.5% of leagues right now, so if you're in a 14-team league and above, definitely pick up Shake Milton right now. And like I mentioned, I'd pick up all the shallow league guys before them if they're on your waiver wire, but if all those guys are gone, you're looking for a waiver pickup, Shake Milton would be a good add in my opinion. Anyways, next up, Torrey Craig. This one's a bit of a weird one, because Torrey Craig's just, not that great of a player. But last 7 days, he's averaging around 34 fantasy points per game, having a few decent rebounding games, contributing in the stocks category, hitting his three-pointers, averaging around 14 points per game recently. So if he's going to ride this hot stretch, I mean, the Phoenix Suns are also dealing with injuries to Cam Johnson, as we're all aware. Cam Johnson, Chris Paul, etc. They're turning to other players, and it looks like Torrey Craig has somewhat been providing some decent fantasy value, so I would consider rostering him this week. The only problem is the Phoenix Suns only have 3 games, and they have a back-to-back Friday and Saturday, so Torrey Craig is a pretty conditional pickup. I would probably pick him up on Friday of this week, just so you can take advantage of him having the back-to-back. Again, he's only rostered in about 2.7% of leagues right now, so the odds are he's probably on your waiver wire, so definitely look at picking him up around Friday. And then moving on, next up we got John Conchar of the Memphis Grizzlies. 2 solid games back-to-back, 44 fantasy points in both of them against OKC and Brooklyn. 7 assists against Brooklyn tonight as well, which was very surprising to see. But yeah, I mean, he's had a few decent scoring games. He's a good shooter. He's getting some open looks here and there, getting more shot opportunities with Ja Morant being out. Like I said, whenever Ja goes down, it becomes more of a team effort for the Grizzlies. Everyone starts to get involved and contribute across the board in fantasy, and Contra is just another example of that. So definitely pick him up if he's on the waiver wire. Again, only rostered in 3% of leagues right now, so the odds that he's there are pretty high statistically, so I would definitely consider him must roster as well. Moving on, we got Jalen Duren. This is due to the again, I'm pretty much saying the same shit for every single one of these players, so apologies for repeating myself, but with the injuries to Isaiah Stewart and Cade Cunningham, Jalen Duren's seen an increase in his minutes. I was between putting him and Bagley, but just the fact that Duren has been getting the majority of the minutes over Bagley, I decided to put him in here. Last 2 games, he's had 29 and 28 fantasy points respectively, getting a few more dunks at the rim, a few block shots here and there. And again, a solid rebounder as well. Very solid rebounder for a rookie. Was not expecting him to really do much for fantasy this year, but I mean, look at the injuries to Isaiah Stewart. Just opens up opportunities for other players. And then lastly, we have another conditional ad. This one I only put on a whim because of this. At the very end of this Wizards game that just happened, it looked like Beal hurt his quadricep. So Jordan Goodwin is a conditional pickup only if Beal does have some negative injury news and he's going to be missing the next game again on Wednesday. But yeah, Jordan Goodwin, I would pick him up on Wednesday if you get news that Beal is out. If not, you can just disregard him as a fantasy waiver wire option. I would go with any of the other guys I've mentioned over him. Very conditional, just on Wednesday and dependent on the Beal news. So that's going to wrap it up for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope this helps you out in making your waiver decisions this week. If there's anyone you think I missed or anyone you think is must roster, leave a comment. Let people know so they can pick them up as well. We're going to have a buy low players video probably coming out tomorrow, I would imagine. So stay tuned for that. I'll give you guys a list of some of my buy low options for this week. And yeah, that's going to do it for me. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.